20 decades ago, I pulled a freezing 3-year-old girl out of a trash-filled alleyway while her biological mother vanished into the night. Today, at her college graduation, that same woman stepped out of a chauffeured Maybach and handed my daughter the keys to a $3 million estate. She told her she had finally proven herself worthy of their bloodline. My daughter took those keys, looked at the vintage watch I had spent 6 months tracking down for her, and said 5 words that shattered my chest. I do not need you anymore. But as my own sister stepped out of that same Maybach to laugh at my pain, they had no idea that I already knew the horrifying medical secret hiding inside that velvet box. The Atlanta sun was beating down on the campus lawn, casting a golden glow over the sea of graduating seniors. It was a day I had prayed for, worked for, and bled for over the last 2 decades. I stood near the edge of the quad, clutching a small velvet box in my sweating palms. Inside was a vintage gold timepiece from the 1940s. It was not flashy, but it was elegant and rare, something I had spent 6 months tracking down through antique dealers. I had the back engraved with a simple message: "For my Zuri, my greatest achievement." I was so incredibly proud of her. She looked beautiful in her cap and gown, her box braids pulled back neatly, her face glowing with the promise of the future. I had raised her from a terrified toddler who used to hoard bread under her pillow into a brilliant, confident college graduate. I took a step forward, ready to hand her the watch, when the heavy crunch of gravel behind me made me freeze. A convoy of 3 black SUVs pulled directly onto the manicured grass, ignoring the campus security guards who tried to wave them off. The doors of the lead Maybach swung open, and the air literally seemed to leave the quad. Out stepped Vivian. She was a vision of ruthless billionaire elegance, wearing a custom emerald green suit that draped perfectly over her frame, her natural hair styled in a flawless crown. I recognized her immediately. I had spent the last 20 years seeing her face on the covers of financial magazines and business journals. She was the CEO of one of the largest holding companies in the country. She was also the woman who had birthed Zuri and left her begging in the rain. Vivian did not even look at me. She walked right past my shoulder, smelling of oud and old money, flanked by 2 massive private security guards. She walked straight up to Zuri, who was standing frozen, clutching her diploma. Vivian smiled, a practiced, camera-ready smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek black box. She popped it open right there in front of the flashing cameras of the local press, who had apparently been tipped off to follow her. Inside rested a heavy brass key and a folded property deed. "You have grown into an exceptional young woman," Vivian announced, her voice carrying across the silent lawn. "You have shown the drive, the intelligence, and the grace that defines our family. You have proven you are worthy of coming home. This is for you, my darling daughter. A $3 million estate in Buckhead, so you can start your new life where you truly belong." I watched the breath leave Zuri's body. I watched her eyes widen as she took in the gleaming key, the deed, the sheer, overwhelming gravity of sudden extreme wealth. For a moment, I expected her to pull back. I expected the girl I had raised, the girl who knew the value of hard work and loyalty, to question why this woman who had ignored her existence for 20 years was suddenly buying her affection. But the seduction of the cameras, the flashing lights, and the intoxicating promise of a billionaire lifestyle blinded her. Zuri reached out and took the box. I stepped forward, my heart pounding against my ribs. I held out my small vintage box, offering the gold watch, the symbol of everything we had survived together. "Zuri," I said, my voice trembling just a fraction, "I am so proud of you. I got you this." Zuri looked down at the modest watch in my hand. Then she looked at the diamond-encrusted Cartier timepiece glittering on Vivian's wrist. The comparison was silent, but deafening. Zuri's expression shifted from surprise to something cold and calculating. She looked me dead in the eye, clutching the deed to the mansion, and delivered the final fatal blow. "I do not need you anymore." The words hit me like a physical strike to the chest. My breath hitched, but before I could even process the devastating weight of her rejection, a sharp, familiar laugh cut through the heavy air. Stepping out from the second SUV right behind Vivian's security detail was my older sister, Jada. And right beside her, looking as smug and condescending as ever, was her husband, Greg. Greg adjusted the collar of his pastel polo shirt, A ridiculous outfit he probably thought made him look like old money, and let out a loud snort. "Come on, Maya," Greg mocked, shaking his head. "Do not embarrass the girl on her big day. A used watch. Really? That is just pathetic. Let the real family take it from here. You have done your little charity work, now step aside." I stared at them, my mind racing. Jada took a leisurely sip from a crystal flute of champagne she had apparently brought from the car. She looked me up and down with absolute disdain. Her resentment toward me had always been a living, breathing thing, but this was a new level of betrayal. She had obviously been the one to facilitate this connection. She had sold me out. "Blood belongs with blood," Maya, Jada sneered, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Vivian is her real mother. They belong in the elite circles. You are just an administrative assistant living in a starter home. You were a temporary babysitter. Zuri is meant for greatness, not mediocrity. Do not make this harder than it has to be." They all turned their backs to me, posing for the photographers Vivian had brought along. They formed a perfect smiling circle of wealth and deception. Zuri stood in the center, beaming as Vivian draped an arm around her shoulder. My own sister stood on the other side, clinking her champagne glass against Greg's. I did not cry. I did not scream. The pain that had initially pierced my chest solidified into something cold, hard, and absolutely unbreakable. I slipped the vintage watch back into my pocket. My face turned to stone. I looked at Jada, who was currently adjusting Zuri's graduation cap for a photo, and I took one step closer to her. I kept my voice low, calm, and razor sharp, just loud enough for her and Greg to hear. "Elite blood," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "That is funny, Jada, because I remember a freezing night in November 20 years ago when elite blood did not mean a thing. I was 15 years old, working a double shift at a greasy diner, scrubbing floors, until my hands bled just so I could buy Zuri her asthma inhaler. And when I brought that sick, wheezing child home, you locked the deadbolt on us. You left us out in the freezing rain because you said you did not want a street rat ruining your social life." Jada's smug smile faltered, her hand tightening around her champagne flute. "I raised her, Jada." I continued, my voice deadly quiet. "I kept her breathing when her real mother threw her away and you locked her out. So do not stand here and lecture me about family. You do not know the meaning of the word. You just follow the highest bidder." Greg puffed out his chest, trying to look intimidating. "Watch your mouth, Maya," he warned, stepping forward. "You are completely out of your league here. Go back to your cubicle before you get hurt." I did not even blink at him. I simply turned on my heel and walked away. I walked across the perfectly manicured grass, leaving the flashing cameras, the fake smiles, and the daughter I had sacrificed my youth for behind me. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders back. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I reached my unassuming sedan parked at the edge of the campus lot. It was a modest car deliberately chosen to maintain the illusion of my average life. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and pulled out a secondary secure phone from the hidden compartment in the center console. The screen lit up immediately, with a high-priority encrypted alert from my lead financial and medical intelligence investigator. I opened the message and the blood ran cold in my veins. "Vivian did not come back for love," the message read. "I breached the locked medical files at the private clinic. They are prepping Zuri for a surgical procedure next week. You need to see this." I stared at the glowing text, the reality of the situation clicking into place with terrifying precision. This was not a reunion. This was a harvest. And my sister had just helped them lead my daughter straight into the slaughterhouse. I started the engine, my grief entirely consumed by a cold, calculated rage. They thought I was just a lowly paper pusher. They thought I was powerless. They were about to find out exactly what kind of empire I had built in the shadows. 20 years ago, I pulled a freezing 3-year-old girl out of a trash-filled alleyway after her biological mother vanished into the night. I gave her my youth, my heart, and my last dime. But yesterday at her college graduation, that same woman stepped out of a chauffeured Maybach and handed my daughter the keys to a $3 million estate. She told her she had finally proven herself worthy of their elite bloodline. My daughter took those keys, looked at the vintage watch I had spent 6 months tracking down for her, and said 5 words that shattered my soul. "I do not need you anymore." As my own sister stepped out of that same Maybach to laugh at my pain, They had no idea that I was not the helpless administrative assistant they thought I was. They had no idea. I already knew the horrifying medical secret hiding inside that velvet box, and they were entirely unprepared for the empire I was about to bring crashing down on their heads. I stared at the encrypted alert on my secure phone, the glow of the screen illuminating the dark interior of my sedan. The words burned themselves into my memory. Vivian did not come back for love. I breached the locked medical files. They are prepping Zuri for a surgical procedure next week. You need to see this. The air in my car felt suddenly thin. This was never a heartwarming reunion between a lost billionaire mother and her child. It was a calculated harvest. I started the engine, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I drove away from the university campus, my mind already shifting from the grief of a rejected mother to the cold precision of a corporate tactician. I had empires to dismantle. 2 days later, I was standing in the kitchen of my modest suburban home pouring a cup of black coffee. I bought this 3-bedroom house a decade ago and deliberately kept it exactly as it was. No luxury renovations, no flashy cars in the driveway. It was the perfect camouflage. My family loved to pity my average life and I let them. It kept their greedy hands out of my actual accounts. The doorbell chimed a sharp sound that shattered the quiet morning. I checked the security feed on my tablet. Standing on my porch was my older sister Jada, wearing a smug smile and a designer trench coat she definitely could not afford. Next to her was her husband Greg, checking his reflection in his phone screen. Beside them stood a nervous-looking man clutching a thick manila envelope. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Jada did not even wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the entryway, her heels clicking aggressively against my hardwood floor. Greg followed, bringing the nervous stranger with him. The stranger stepped forward, thrusting the heavy envelope into my chest. He asked if I was Maya. When I nodded, he declared I had been served and practically ran back to his car. I tossed the envelope onto my kitchen island and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. I asked Jada if breaking and entering was her new weekend hobby. Jada laughed, tossing her designer bag onto my dining table. "Read the papers before you try to act tough, Maya," she said. I slid the documents out of the envelope. It was a civil lawsuit filed by Vivian's elite legal team. The charges were laughable but legally weaponized: parental alienation, emotional damages, and a demand for $500,000 in restitution. The lawsuit claimed I had manipulated Zuri for 20 years, keeping her isolated from her true wealthy heritage. It was a textbook intimidation tactic designed to bleed a working-class African-American woman dry in legal fees. Vivian thought she was dealing with a receptionist who would panic at the sight of a $500,000 demand. Greg walked over to my coffee maker, picking up a mug and inspecting it with blatant disgust before setting it back down. He smirked, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive but poorly fitted shirt. Greg casually leaned against my laminate counter, invading my space with the unearned confidence of a mediocre white man who thought he held all the cards. "You are in way over your head, Maya," he said. "Vivian's lawyers will drag you through court for a decade and leave you bankrupt living on the street." But then his smile widened into something genuinely sinister. "He told me he was there to offer me a lifeline, a way out of the mess I had created by trying to hold on to a child who belonged to a billionaire." Jada stepped up next to him, her eyes gleaming with malice. She explained that Vivian did not actually want the terrible press of a messy court battle right after her miraculous family reunion. Greg laid out the terms. Vivian had drafted a non-disclosure agreement and a formal relinquishment of all my past parental rights. If I signed the papers surrendering any legal or emotional claim to Zuri and swearing to never contact her again, Vivian would drop the lawsuit entirely. I looked at Greg, letting him talk, letting him dig his own grave. I asked him what was in it for them. Why would my sister and her husband act as errand boys for a billionaire they just met? Greg puffed out his chest, clearly thrilled to brag. He boasted that bringing Zuri and Vivian together was a highly lucrative networking move. Vivian was so grateful to them that she was giving Greg's commercial real estate firm a massive capital injection. It was a finder's fee for orchestrating the reunion and facilitating the legal cleanup. Jada crossed her arms, looking around my humble kitchen with pure contempt. "Take the deal, Maya," she said. You are just an admin worker making $50,000 a year on a good day. You cannot afford a decent lawyer, let alone fight someone with Vivian's resources. Take the outsign away your rights and go back to your pathetic, quiet little life before Vivian crushes you completely. They stood there, the golden couple, absolutely convinced they had trapped a helpless animal in a corner. They thought my silence was fear. They had no idea it was a calculation. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and walked over to my dining table where my laptop sat closed. You have always been terrible at math, Greg, I said. I opened the laptop. It was currently displaying the dummy desktop interface I used whenever my nosy family came around. I typed in a complex sequence of keystrokes, bypassing the firewall and logging directly into my firm's encrypted global server. The screen shifted from a generic wallpaper to a dark multi-tiered financial dashboard tracking billions of dollars in active corporate debt, hostile takeovers, and crisis management portfolios. I turned the screen so it faced Greg directly. I looked him dead in the eye. I do not push paper for a living, I said. I founded and run one of the premier financial intelligence and crisis management firms on the East Coast. I build empires by tearing down corrupt ones. Greg squinted at the screen, his smug smile faltering as he recognized the high-level banking software. I tapped the keyboard, pulling up a specific highly classified dossier. It contained the exact routing numbers, property deeds, and loan default warnings for every single building in Greg's commercial real estate portfolio. I watched the color drain completely out of Greg's face as he stared at his own catastrophic financial ruin displayed on my screen. I explained the situation to him using slow, deliberate words. I told him his real estate firm had been secretly bleeding cash for 18 months. I knew he had taken out toxic high-interest loans to maintain the illusion of his wealthy lifestyle. I knew his primary lenders were preparing to foreclose. And then I delivered the kill shot. My firm bought out all of your toxic debt 3 days ago through a proxy holding company, I told him. I am now your primary creditor. I pointed to the screen, showing him that he was exactly 60 days in default on his payments. I owned his buildings. I owned his business. I owned him. Jada slapped her hand on the table, her voice shrill and frantic. You are bluffing, she screamed. You are just a jealous, pathetic paper pusher who mocked up some fake documents to scare us. Greg, do not listen to her. Put her in her place. But Greg could not speak. He was trembling, his eyes glued to the internal banking codes on the screen that only his senior accountants should have access to. He knew the numbers were real. He knew his life as a wealthy developer was over. I told Jada she should really pay more attention to her husband's finances before she tries to extort the woman who actually holds the leash. While Jada was hyperventilating, desperately shaking Greg's arm to make him say something, anything to prove I was lying, a sharp, urgent ringtone cut through the chaos. It was not my standard phone ring. It was the secure emergency line I kept explicitly for high-level crises. I grabbed the phone, my eyes never leaving Greg's terrified face. I answered the call. It was Zuri. Her voice was not the confident, cruel tone she had used at graduation. She was sobbing hysterically, her breath catching in jagged, terrified gasps. Mom, she cried, the word tearing through my heart. Mom, please help me. They will not let me leave the estate. The doors are locked. The doctors are here. I tried to speak, to demand her exact location in the house, but a loud scuffling sound echoed through the speaker. A man's voice barked a harsh command in the background. Zuri screamed my name one last time, and then the line went dead. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. I had spent the last 48 hours tearing through encrypted medical files and offshore bank accounts. My home office, which my family thought was just a storage room for old clothes, was actually a secure command center. I had barely slept. The alert from my lead investigator played on a loop in my mind. Vivian did not come back for love. She was prepping Zuri for a surgical procedure. It took my team less than a day to uncover the horrific truth hiding behind Vivian's perfectly crafted public relations campaign. Vivian had a legitimate son, a young man, who was the sole heir to her late husband's multi-billion-dollar trust fund. But that son was dying from a rare terminal organ failure. Vivian had abandoned Zuri in an alley 20 years ago to hide the evidence of a reckless affair. Now she had returned not to make amends, but because her discarded daughter was the only living genetic match for the golden child. Vivian needed a donor, and she was willing to buy one with a $3 million house. I was standing in my kitchen drinking my fourth cup of black coffee and formulating a strategy to extract Zuri when the doorbell chimed. It was a sharp sound that shattered the quiet morning. I pulled up the security camera feed on my tablet. Standing on my front porch was my older sister Jada. She was wearing a smug smile and a designer trench coat she definitely could not afford on her salary. Next to her was her husband Greg checking his reflection in his phone screen. Beside them stood a nervous-looking man clutching a thick manila envelope. I knew exactly what this was. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Jada did not even wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the entryway, her heels clicking aggressively against my hardwood floor. Greg followed, bringing the nervous stranger with him. The stranger stepped forward, thrusting the heavy envelope into my chest. He asked if I was Maya. When I nodded, he declared I had been served and practically ran back to his car, peeling out of my driveway. I tossed the envelope onto my kitchen island and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. I asked Jada if breaking and entering was her new weekend hobby. Jada laughed, tossing her designer bag onto my dining table like she owned the place. She told me to read the papers before I tried to act tough. I slid the thick stack of documents out of the envelope. It was a civil lawsuit filed by Vivian's elite legal team in downtown Atlanta. The charges were completely fabricated but legally weaponized to inflict maximum damage. The suit accused me of parental alienation, emotional damages, and deliberate psychological manipulation. Vivian was demanding $500,000 in restitution. The paperwork claimed I had manipulated Zuri for 20 years, keeping her isolated from her true wealthy heritage out of pure spite and jealousy. It was a textbook intimidation tactic designed to bleed a working-class woman dry in legal fees. Vivian thought she was dealing with a low-level administrative assistant who would panic at the sight of a $500,000 demand. She thought the sheer weight of her legal team would force me into submission. Greg walked over to my coffee maker, picking up a mug and inspecting it with blatant disgust before setting it back down. He smirked, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive but poorly fitted shirt. He leaned against my laminate counter, invading my space with the unearned confidence of a mediocre white man who thought he held all the cards in the room. "You are in way over your head, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Vivian's lawyers will drag you through court for a decade. They will freeze whatever pathetic little savings account you have and leave you bankrupt, living on the street." Jada stepped up next to him, her eyes gleaming with malice. She crossed her arms, looking around my humble kitchen with pure contempt. She told me I should have just walked away quietly at the graduation instead of making a scene. She said Vivian was a billionaire and I was just a paper pusher making $50,000 on a good day. She actually believed I was going to lose everything. In fact, she desperately wanted me to lose everything. The jealousy Jada had harbored toward me since childhood had finally found a wealthy sponsor. She had spent her whole life trying to prove she was better than me, simply because she married a commercial real estate developer. She ignored the fact that Greg was terrible with money and constantly making bad investments. All that mattered to Jada was the illusion of wealth. And now Vivian had validated her, giving her a taste of the billionaire lifestyle just for handing over my daughter. Greg pulled another document from his jacket pocket and slapped it onto the counter next to the lawsuit. It was a settlement offer. He explained that Vivian did not actually want the terrible press of a messy court battle right after her miraculous family reunion. He laid out the terms with a sickening level of arrogance. If I signed the non-disclosure agreement and legally relinquished all past parental rights over Zuri, Vivian would drop the lawsuit entirely. I would have to swear to never contact my daughter again. In return, Vivian would let me walk away without destroying my life. I looked at Greg, letting him talk, letting him dig his own grave. I asked him what was in it for them. Why would my sister and her husband act as errand boys for a billionaire they just met? Greg puffed out his chest, clearly thrilled to brag. He boasted that bringing Zuri and Vivian together was a highly lucrative networking move. Vivian was so grateful to them that she was giving Greg's commercial real estate firm a massive capital injection. It was a finder's fee for orchestrating the reunion and facilitating the legal cleanup. Take the deal, Maya Jada said, tapping her manicured fingernails against the settlement offer. You cannot afford a decent lawyer, let alone fight someone with Vivian's infinite resources. You are going to lose this battle and you are going to lose your house. Just sign away your rights and go back to your pathetic, quiet little life before Vivian crushes you completely. They stood there, the golden couple, absolutely convinced they had trapped a helpless animal in a corner. I looked at the two of them, letting their insults wash over me without reacting. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and looked back down at the lawsuit. $500,000. I made that much in interest while I was sleeping. My crisis management firm handled international accounts worth billions. But I let them talk. I knew exactly what Greg was hiding. I knew exactly how heavily leveraged his real estate business was. He was standing in my kitchen mocking my salary while his own commercial properties were teetering on the edge of foreclosure. They thought my silence was fear. They had no idea it was a calculation. I placed my coffee mug down on the counter and prepared to show them exactly who they had just declared war against. I reached across the kitchen island and pulled my laptop toward me. It was a standard silver model, exactly the kind of inexpensive machine you would expect a mid-level administrative worker to own. I flipped the screen open. Jada rolled her eyes, sighing loudly, as if I was wasting her precious time. Greg chuckled under his breath, telling me I could not Google my way out of a $500,000 lawsuit, and that pretending to look for a lawyer online was just making me look more pathetic. I ignored them both. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. I did not type in my usual password. Instead, I entered a complex sequence of alphanumeric keystrokes that bypassed the dummy interface I kept active for exactly this reason. For a decade, I had let my family believe I was pushing paper in a sterile cubicle because it kept their greedy hands out of my business. Now the camouflage was no longer necessary. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before my actual operating system booted up. I turned the laptop slightly so Greg had a clear view of the monitor. I kept my voice perfectly even, completely devoid of the panic they were so desperately hoping to see. I told Greg he had always been terrible at doing his homework. I watched his smug, condescending smile falter just a millimeter as the high-contrast financial dashboard materialized on the screen. It was a proprietary interface, reserved strictly for institutional investors and elite corporate liquidators. I told him I did not push paper for a living. I told him I built empires by dismantling corrupt ones. I explained that I was the founder and chief executive of one of the premier financial intelligence and crisis management firms on the East Coast. My firm handled billion-dollar corporate crises, international debt restructuring, and hostile takeovers. I did not make $50,000 a year. I made that much in interest while I was sleeping. Greg leaned in closer, his brow furrowing as he tried to comprehend what he was looking at. He recognized the software. Any commercial developer swimming in debt would recognize the tracking systems used by top-tier banks. I tapped the pad and brought up a highly classified dossier my intelligence team had compiled over the last 48 hours. I read the official LLC name of his commercial real estate firm out loud. I recited the addresses of his 3 most prized properties in the downtown district. I watched the color completely drain from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly as I rattled off his exact bank routing numbers, his hidden offshore accounts, and the precise dollar amount of the toxic high-interest loans he had taken out. He had leveraged everything he owned to fund Jada's luxury shopping habits and to keep his failing business afloat. Jada was looking back and forth between us, her perfectly contoured face twisting in confusion. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She told Greg to stop looking at my screen and put me in my place to remind me that Vivian was going to crush me. But Greg was paralyzed. He was staring at the blinking red numbers on my dashboard that indicated a critical default status. I leaned over the kitchen island, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. I told him Vivian's little cash injection finder's fee was not going to save him. I explained that a multi-million-dollar payout from a billionaire might stop a normal bank from foreclosing, but he was no longer dealing with a normal bank. I told him my proxy holding company had bought out every single one of his toxic commercial loans 3 days ago. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. I was not just some working-class woman he could intimidate in her own kitchen. I was his primary creditor. I owned his debt. I owned his buildings. I owned his entire professional future. I pointed to the screen detailing exactly how many days his accounts were in arrears. 60 days, Greg, I said. You are exactly 60 days in default on your primary commercial properties. Do you know what my firm does at 90 days? I initiate immediate foreclosure. I seize the properties. I liquidate your corporate assets, and I leave you with absolutely nothing but the designer shirt on your back. Jada finally seemed to understand the gravity of the words coming out of my mouth. Her shrill voice echoed off my kitchen cabinets as she accused me of bluffing. She slammed her hand down on the lawsuit papers Vivian had sent, screaming that I was just a jealous, pathetic sister trying to scare them with fake spreadsheets. She insisted I was making it all up because I was terrified of losing Zuri and going bankrupt. I did not even look at Jada. I kept my eyes locked on Greg, who was currently sweating profusely through the collar of his pastel shirt. I told Jada she should really spend less time picking out expensive trench coats and more time reviewing her husband's bank statements before trying to extort the woman who actually held their leash. Greg's hands were shaking visibly now. The reality of his complete financial ruin was sitting right there on a laminate counter in the suburbs. He tried to speak, to negotiate, to backtrack his earlier insults, but no words came out. His mouth opened and closed as he stared at the red default warnings on my screen. He had walked into my home expecting to force me to sign away my daughter for nothing. He had expected me to cower at the threat of a billionaire's legal team. Instead, he found himself standing in front of the very person who controlled his financial survival. I asked him if he still thought I could not afford to fight a billionaire. I asked him if he wanted to reconsider his generous offer to let me walk away quietly. He just stood there, completely broken, stripped of his arrogance, and fully aware that his entire life was resting in the palm of my hand. Greg looked like he might actually vomit right there on my kitchen floor. The arrogant sneer he had walked in with was completely gone, replaced by a sickly pale sweat that beaded on his forehead. He opened his mouth to say something, to negotiate or beg or threaten, but his throat was too dry to form the words. He knew I had him trapped in a corner with no way out. I knew that the massive cash injection Vivian had promised him for selling out my daughter would not even put a dent in the staggering amount of commercial debt I now legally controlled. He was paralyzed by the realization that his entire identity as a wealthy, successful real estate developer was a complete illusion, and I was the one holding the hammer ready to shatter it. Jada, however, was not ready to surrender her delusions of grandeur. She slammed her hands onto the kitchen island, her diamond rings clacking sharply against the granite surface. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, refusing to accept the reality displayed right in front of her. She told Greg to stop looking at my screen and to put me in my place. She shrieked that I was just a jealous, pathetic sister trying to scare them with fake spreadsheets and fabricated banking codes. She insisted I was making it all up because I was terrified of losing Zuri and going bankrupt from Vivian's lawsuit. She actually reached across the counter, her manicured nails swiping at my laptop, trying to slam it shut to make the bad numbers go away. I caught her wrist mid-air. I did not squeeze hard, but my grip was unyielding and absolute. I looked into her panicked, furious eyes and told her to pay very close attention to what she was about to see. With my free hand, I tapped a single key on the keyboard. The heavy-duty laser printer in my home office hummed to life. I released Jada's wrist, walked down the short hallway, retrieved the freshly printed documents, and walked back to the kitchen. I dropped the thick stack of papers right on top of Vivian's ridiculous extortion lawsuit. I told Jada to read the bottom line. It was the official transfer of debt agreement bearing the authenticated signatures of the original bank executives and my own signature as the purchasing entity. It was not a digital illusion on a computer screen. It was a legally binding federal document proving I owned every single thing her husband claimed to possess. I watched Jada's eyes dart across the page. I watched her read the total sum of the toxic loans Greg had hidden from her. Millions upon millions of dollars in default. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. Her jaw trembled as she looked at her husband, who could not even make eye contact with her. He just stared at the floor, breathing heavily. I leaned in close so only they could hear the cold certainty in my voice. I told them they had walked into my home expecting to ruin my life, but they had just handed me the keys to ruin theirs. I told Greg I was initiating the foreclosure process on his commercial properties the second they walked out of my door. I promised Jada that by the end of the month, she would be auctioning off those designer coats and luxury handbags just to afford a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. They had sold my daughter to a billionaire for a payout that no longer existed, and now they were going to lose absolutely everything. Jada started to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved as she grabbed Greg's arm, shaking him, demanding he do something, demanding he fix it. She yelled at him to call his lawyers, to call Vivian to make it stop. But Greg just stared blankly at the foreclosure documents, realizing his entire empire had just evaporated into dust. There was no lawyer who could save him from a legal debt transfer. There was no billionaire coming to rescue him. Before I could tell them to get out of my house, a sharp, urgent ringtone cut through the chaos in the kitchen. It was not my standard phone ring. It was the secure, encrypted emergency line I kept exclusively for high-level corporate crises and immediate threats. I grabbed the phone from the counter, my eyes never leaving Greg and Jada. I answered the call, expecting an update from my financial intelligence team regarding Vivian's shell companies. Instead, I heard a sound that made the blood run ice cold in my veins. It was Zuri. Her voice was not the confident, cruel tone she had used at graduation. It lacked the haughty arrogance she had displayed when she held up those mansion keys and told me she did not need me anymore. She was sobbing hysterically, her breath catching in jagged, terrified gasps that echoed through the small speaker of my phone. "Mom," she cried, the word tearing through my chest like a physical blade. "Mom, please help me." Every ounce of cold corporate calculation vanished in an instant. I was no longer a CEO dismantling a rival firm. I was a mother hearing her child in immediate visceral danger. The adrenaline spiked so hard my vision tunneled. I demanded to know where she was and what was happening, telling her to stay calm and talk to me. "They will not let me leave the estate," Zuri sobbed, her voice trembling with absolute terror. She sounded like the frightened 3-year-old girl I had pulled out of that alley 20 years ago. "The doors are locked. The doctors are here and they are saying I have to get ready for the wellness procedure." "Mom, I am scared. They took my things. They took my regular phone. I found this one in a desk drawer. They are not letting me out of the guest wing. Please come get me." I tried to speak, to tell her I was already on my way, to demand she lock herself in an ensuite bathroom and barricade the door until I arrived. I opened my mouth to give her instructions, but before I could get the words out, a loud, violent, scuffling sound echoed through the speaker. I heard a heavy thud followed by a man's voice barking a harsh command in the background, telling her to put the unauthorized device down immediately. Zuri screamed my name one last time, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic that will haunt me for the rest of my life. And then the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood in my kitchen staring at the blank black screen of my phone. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy, charged with a violent electric tension. Greg and Jada were still standing by the kitchen island, watching me, but they no longer mattered. Their petty greed, their malicious lawsuits, and their impending financial ruin were completely irrelevant. Vivian had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had trapped my daughter and brought unknown medical personnel into her home against Zuri's will. I looked up at Jada and Greg. They saw the rapid shift in my eyes, the complete eradication of my restraint, and both of them instinctively took a cautious step back toward the front door. I told them to get out of my house before I decided to take more than just their money. I did not wait to watch them scramble out the front door in a panic. I was already moving, grabbing my car keys, my secure laptop, and a heavy lockbox from my home office. Vivian wanted to play a ruthless game of power and control with my family. She was about to find out exactly what happens when you threaten the child of a woman who knows how to burn down empires. The line went dead, and a suffocating silence slammed into my kitchen. For 3 seconds, the only sound was my own ragged breathing as I stared at the black screen of my phone. Greg and Jada were still standing by the kitchen island. I could see the panic vibrating off them, but they no longer mattered. They were just pawns, greedy, foolish pawns, who had handed my daughter over to a monster. I looked up at them, and the absolute pure rage in my eyes made Greg physically recoil. I told them to get out of my house before I decided to take more than just their real estate portfolio. They did not say a word. They scrambled for the door, tripping over each other in their rush to escape the storm they had just unleashed. I did not waste a single second watching them leave. I was already moving. I grabbed my car, my secure laptop, and a heavy fireproof lockbox from my home office. I sprinted to my car and threw it in gear, my tires screeching against the pavement as I tore out of the driveway. I mapped the route to the $3 million estate in Buckhead. It was a 30-minute drive, but I made it in 20, weaving through traffic with a cold, terrifying focus. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but my mind was operating with lethal clarity. Vivian wanted to play a ruthless game of power and control with my family. She had no idea she had just declared war on a woman who dismantled billionaires for a living. I pulled onto the winding, tree-lined street that housed Atlanta's ultra-elite. The houses here were fortresses set far back from the road, hidden behind ancient oaks and towering brick walls. I reached the address Vivian had so proudly flaunted on the graduation lawn. It was a massive, sprawling property, gated by 12-foot-high wrought iron bars. Parked strategically across the inside of the driveway were two black SUVs. 4 private security contractors stood shoulder to shoulder behind the iron gate. They were large, heavily armed, and wearing matching tactical suits. They looked less like a residential security detail and more like a paramilitary extraction team. I slammed on the brakes, leaving my car running diagonally across the entrance, blocking the driveway completely. I stepped out of the vehicle and marched directly up to the iron gate. The lead security guard, a massive man with a thick neck and cold eyes, stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me this was private property and instructed me to return to my vehicle immediately. I gripped the cold iron bars and told him I was not leaving without my daughter. I demanded they open the gate. I demanded to see Zuri. The guards did not even blink. They simply tightened their formation, forming a solid human wall between me and the sprawling stone mansion in the distance. The lead guard reached for his radio, pressing a finger to his earpiece. Before he could speak, a figure emerged from the heavy mahogany front doors of the estate. It was Vivian. She walked down the long paved driveway with the leisurely, unbothered stride of a woman who believed she was entirely untouchable. She was wearing a flowing silk robe, her natural hair wrapped perfectly, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She looked like she was enjoying a relaxing Sunday morning, not holding a terrified 23-year-old girl hostage against her will. She approached the gate but stopped several feet away, keeping the armed men and the heavy iron bars safely between us. Vivian took a slow sip of her water and smiled. It was a chilling, hollow expression, completely devoid of any human warmth. She looked at me standing on the street in my plain clothes, my chest heaving with adrenaline, and she let out a soft, condescending laugh. She told me I was making a fool of myself. She said the neighbors would complain about the noise if I kept shouting. I ignored her condescension. I told her I just spoke to Zuri on a burner phone. I told her I heard the panic in my daughter's voice and the sound of someone physically restraining her. I gripped the bars tighter, my knuckles turning white, and told Vivian that if she did not open the gate and bring Zuri out to me right now, I was going to call the federal authorities and report a kidnapping. Vivian did not look threatened in the slightest. She casually inspected her manicured fingernails. She told me I was being terribly dramatic and that my working-class anxiety was exactly why Zuri needed to be removed from my toxic environment. She spoke with a smooth, calculated rhythm, clearly used to controlling every narrative she stepped into. She explained that Zuri was simply resting. She claimed my daughter had been overwhelmed by the emotional graduation weekend and the sudden transition to a higher class of living. According to Vivian, Zuri was absolutely fine, just a little confused. She smiled that terrible empty smile again and told me that Zuri's phone had been confiscated for her own health and peace of mind. Vivian claimed she had hired a private medical team to conduct a comprehensive wellness retreat right here on the estate. She said Zuri needed to be detoxed from the stress of her previous mediocre life before she could fully embrace her new billionaire status. She said the medical staff had recommended complete isolation so Zuri could prepare for a minor upcoming wellness procedure without any outside distractions. A wellness procedure. The words echoed in my head, matching perfectly with the encrypted alert my lead investigator had sent me. They are prepping Zuri for a surgical procedure. The sheer audacity of Vivian standing there lying to my face while her hired muscle kept me locked out made my blood boil. I told Vivian she was a liar. I told her I knew she did not come back to Atlanta out of some sudden maternal guilt. I demanded to know what kind of procedure she was forcing upon my daughter. Vivian's smile finally vanished, replaced by a hard, aristocratic glare. She stepped slightly closer to the gate, looking down her nose at me. She told me I had no legal rights. She reminded me that Zuri was a legal adult who had willingly accepted the deed to the property and willingly walked into the house. Vivian said she had an army of lawyers who would crush me before I even made it to a courtroom steps. She told me to go back to my pathetic suburban house, to my little administrative job, and to forget I ever had a daughter. She said blood always finds its way back to blood, and I was officially dismissed. Vivian turned her back on me gracefully, walking back up the driveway toward the massive stone mansion. The lead security guard warned me that if I touched the gate again, he would have me arrested for trespassing and harassment. I stood there on the pavement staring through the iron bars. Every maternal instinct inside me was screaming to scale the gate, to fight the armed men, to tear the doors off that house with my bare hands to get to my child. But the cold, tactical side of my brain, the part that had built a financial empire from nothing, pulled me back. If I fought them now, I would be arrested. I would be locked in a holding cell while Vivian carried out whatever twisted medical harvesting she had planned for Zuri. I could not save my daughter from behind bars. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow, forcing the red haze of rage to clear from my vision. Vivian thought I was a desperate, powerless woman crying at her gate. She thought her wealth made her a god. I turned away from the iron bars and walked slowly back to my car. I did not look back. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I pulled out my encrypted secure phone and dialed my corporate headquarters. It was time to stop playing the grieving mother and start acting like the predator I truly was. I told my crisis team to prepare the war room. I was coming into the city, and we were going to tear Vivian's empire down to the studs. I slammed my foot onto the accelerator, throwing my unassuming sedan into gear and tearing away from the iron gates of that sprawling estate. I merged onto the highway, heading straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. The city skyline grew larger through my windshield, mirroring the magnitude of what I was about to do. For 20 years, I had played the role of the quiet, humble mother. I had endured the mocking laughter of my sister Jada and her arrogant husband. I had let them believe I was just a low-level administrative worker barely scraping by because keeping my true life in the shadows protected me and my daughter. But the time for playing small was over. Vivian thought she had successfully locked a terrified girl inside her stone fortress. She thought her private security force and her billionaire status made her a god. She had no idea she had just declared war on a woman who hunted gods for a living. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek, towering glass high-rise in the financial district. I bypassed the public elevators, entirely swiping my encrypted biometric card to access the private executive lift. The heavy metal doors slid open to the top floor, revealing the true nerve center of my firm. The polished obsidian walls, the rows of high-performance servers humming quietly in the background, the panoramic windows looking down on the city. This was my domain. I was not a grieving mother crying on a suburban street anymore. I was the apex predator of the corporate intelligence sector, and I was about to rip Vivian's life apart piece by piece. I walked straight into the main bullpen of the office, clapping my hands twice. The low murmur of my analysts instantly went dead silent. Every head turned toward me. I called out to Malik, my lead forensic accountant, and Chloe, my head of cyber intelligence. I told them to drop whatever billion-dollar international mergers they were currently monitoring and to get into the war room immediately. I announced a code-red crisis protocol. They did not ask a single question. They knew my tone. They grabbed their encrypted tablets and followed me swiftly into the massive glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. I slammed my heavy lockbox onto the custom mahogany table and brought up the primary projection screen that covered the entire back wall of the room. I looked at Malik and Chloe and told them we were going hunting. Our target was Vivian and every single asset holding company and trust fund attached to her name. I gave them the parameters of the strike. I wanted every shell company, every offshore account, every highly leveraged asset cracked wide open. Vivian projected an image of untouchable wealth, but my decade of experience tearing down corrupt executives told me that anyone moving with that much aggressive desperation was hiding something massive. True billionaires who were secure in their wealth did not ambush a college graduation with a rented camera crew and a sudden $3 million house presentation unless they desperately needed a public relations smokescreen. They definitely did not confiscate a 23-year-old girl's phone and lock her behind iron gates for a mysterious wellness retreat. People with real power do not need to trap their children. Desperate people do. Chloe's fingers flew across her specialized keyboard accessing private banking networks and federal tax filings that standard commercial auditors could never dream of touching. Malik simultaneously began running algorithmic stress tests on Vivian's primary holding company, analyzing her recent market acquisitions and cash flow statements. The data started pouring onto the massive screen, illuminating the dark room with glowing spreadsheets and organizational charts. At first glance, Vivian's empire looked completely immaculate. She had extensive real estate holdings, luxury retail brand acquisitions, and massive international shipping contracts. But as Malik peeled back the glossy top layers of the financial filings, the terrifying rot started to show. I paced the length of the conference room, analyzing the data streams as they populated the screen. I instructed Malik to trace the collateral Vivian had used on her 3 most recent international acquisitions. He ran the trace and his eyes widened in shock. He told me the entire holding company was a massive house of cards. Vivian had leveraged her most valuable corporate assets 3 times over, using the exact same collateral to secure different massive loans from multiple foreign banking institutions. It was a classic, highly illegal shell game. The moment one of those foreign banks realized their collateral was compromised and called in their debt, the entire structure would collapse, triggering an immediate federal investigation and catastrophic bankruptcy. The revelations kept coming faster and faster. Vivian was bleeding cash at an astronomical rate. Her liquid assets were basically non-existent. Chloe pulled up the property records for the $3 million estate in Buckhead, where my daughter was currently being held hostage. The deed had just been transferred to Zuri yesterday, but the property itself had a massive predatory lien against it. It was a trap. It was a shiny object meant to blind a naive college graduate to the reality of the situation. Vivian was not bringing her daughter home to a life of luxury and elite privilege. Vivian was drowning, and she was wrapping a $3 million anchor around Zuri's neck to drag her down with her. I leaned over the mahogany conference table, staring at the catastrophic balance sheets displayed on the wall. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the motive was still entirely wrong. Vivian was desperate. She was cornered by international creditors and staring down the barrel of federal prison for corporate fraud. Yet, in the middle of this absolute corporate meltdown, she had spent precious time and rapidly dwindling capital tracking down the child she had violently thrown away 20 years ago. She had paid off my greedy sister Jada to orchestrate a graduation ambush. It made absolutely no financial sense. You do not acquire a brand new dependent when you are hiding billions in toxic debt. You only do that if the dependent holds the literal key to a massive payout. I turned to Chloe. I told her to pivot away from the corporate accounts immediately. I needed to know the medical angle. I told her to dig straight into Vivian's personal family trust funds and to pull up those encrypted medical files she had alerted me about earlier. If the money to save Vivian's bankrupt empire was not in her business, it had to be tied up tightly in her bloodline. And Vivian was clearly preparing to spill blood to get it. Chloe turned her attention away from the offshore bank accounts and focused her specialized software on the heavily guarded network of Atlanta's most exclusive private medical concierge. The massive projection screen in the war room shifted from the glowing red spreadsheets of Vivian's financial ruin to the stark white background of encrypted health databases. I stood right behind her watching complex lines of code decrypt in real time. We were breaching servers that standard corporate auditors would never even know existed. Malik, my lead forensic accountant, had simultaneously pulled up the documents regarding Vivian's personal family trust. He projected the late husband's estate files right next to the medical records. He told me the late husband had been incredibly paranoid before he died. He had locked his entire multi-billion-dollar fortune inside an ironclad trust. Vivian had absolutely zero access to the principal funds. The only way she could ever touch that money to save her bankrupt holding company was through her legitimate son. Malik highlighted a devastating clause in the legal paperwork. The son was the sole heir to the empire. If he turned 25 years old, the trust would dissolve and the money would transfer directly to him. As his primary legal guardian and Vivian would effectively control those billions. But if the son died before his 25th birthday, the entire fortune would revert to the husband's original family and to various charities. Vivian would be left with absolutely nothing. Chloe finally broke through the last layer of medical encryption, and a sharp gasp escaped her lips. I looked at the patient charts rapidly populating the screen. The legitimate son was 24 years old. He was just months away from unlocking the billions Vivian desperately needed to pay off her international foreign debt and avoid federal prison. But his medical charts painted a fatal picture. He was dying. He had a rare terminal organ failure. His kidneys were completely shutting down, and his liver was heavily compromised. He had been on specialized life support for over a year, and his body was rapidly rejecting the treatments. Chloe pulled up the genetic compatibility reports. The boy had a highly unique blood and tissue type inherited from his father's side. Vivian was not a match. Nobody in the extended family was a match. No one in the National Donor Registry was a match. The boy had weeks to live at absolute best. If he died, Vivian's empire died with him. She would face a federal indictment for her massive corporate fraud, and she would do it completely broke. Then Chloe pulled up the newest file in the system. It was a comprehensive patient profile created just 3 days ago. The name at the top of the file was Zuri. My stomach dropped. A cold wave of pure, unadulterated revulsion washed over me as the puzzle pieces finally snapped together. The picture they formed was so utterly evil it defied basic human comprehension. 20 years ago, Vivian was married to a billionaire holding on to her high society status with a death grip. She had an affair resulting in an unwanted pregnancy, a baby girl who threatened to expose her infidelity and cost her a life of unimaginable wealth. So Vivian did the only thing a true sociopath could do. She threw that 3-year-old child into a freezing alleyway like a bag of trash. She left my daughter to die in the rain while she returned to her mansion and her golden life. But karma had finally come collecting. The golden child, the legitimate heir, was dying. And the only person on the planet with the exact genetic markers needed to save him was the daughter Vivian had so callously thrown away. Vivian did not spend the last year searching for Zuri out of some sudden maternal guilt. She was hunting for spare parts. Money could not buy a matching organ on the transplant list, but it could buy a private investigation to track down an abandoned child. She had paid off my greedy sister Jada to orchestrate a public reunion. She had lured Zuri in with the flashing cameras and the blinding promise of a $3 million estate. It was never a gift, it was a carefully constructed trap. I stared at the private medical schedules displayed brightly on the wall. Vivian had labeled the upcoming surgery a wellness procedure to keep Zuri completely compliant and unaware of the horrific reality. She had deliberately confiscated Zuri's phone, isolating her behind 12-foot iron gates, and brought a private medical team directly onto the estate. Vivian was legally positioning herself to force an immediate transplant operation. She had surrounded Zuri with corporate lawyers and armed guards preparing to coerce a naive 23-year-old girl into signing away her organs. I knew exactly how a monster like Vivian operated. She would use heavy sedatives under the guise of wellness supplements to keep Zuri docile. She would use intense psychological pressure, telling Zuri that signing the medical consent forms was the only way to truly prove she belonged in the family. Once Zuri's signature was on that paper, Vivian's private doctors would put her on an operating table. Vivian did not care if Zuri survived the invasive harvesting procedure. She only cared about keeping the legitimate heir alive long enough to unlock the billions securely locked in that trust fund. The sheer monstrosity of it made the air in the conference room feel toxic. My daughter was not an honored guest in that sprawling stone mansion. She was livestock. She was being prepped for a brutal harvest while heavily medicated and completely cut off from the outside world. Malik and Chloe were dead silent, staring at the glowing projection screen in absolute horror. In our years of taking down corrupt executives and white-collar criminals, we had seen massive embezzlement schemes and ruthless corporate sabotage. We had dismantled billionaires who destroyed entire communities for profit. But we had never seen a mother meticulously plot to butcher her own child just to balance a corporate spreadsheet. I turned away from the screen. The cold, tactical rage that had been guiding my actions sharpened into something far more dangerous. I was a mother who had spent her entire adult life protecting a broken child, and I was not about to let a parasite in a designer suit tear her apart. I told my team to download every single document. I wanted every blood test, every forged consent form, every single line of the trust fund stipulations, and every hidden bank transfer recorded. I wanted it all compiled into an irrefutable federal dossier. I walked toward the heavy glass door of the war room, my mind already mapping out the extraction plan. I would mobilize my private security team. I would secure emergency federal warrants. I would break through those iron gates by any means necessary. I was going to storm that estate, pull my daughter out of that house, and then I was going to burn Vivian's entire world to ashes. I did not run down the corridor of my corporate headquarters. I marched. Every step I took against the polished obsidian floors echoed with the singular, terrifying focus of a mother who had just realized her child was marked for slaughter. I fired off commands to Malik and Chloe without looking back. I told them to package the decrypted medical files, the forged consent forms, and the holding company's toxic debt portfolios into a secure digital vault. I instructed my head of physical security to mobilize a tactical extraction unit immediately. We were not going to politely knock on Vivian's iron gates. I authorized a blank check for the operation. I wanted blueprints of Vivian's sprawling estate pulled from county architectural records. I wanted the private security patrols mapped and timed. My extraction team was entirely composed of former federal agents and elite military contractors. They were securing transport vehicles and preparing to breach the perimeter the moment I gave the signal. We were going to arrive with an overwhelming force of private contractors, and we were going to tear that stone mansion apart brick by brick until I had my daughter safely in my arms. I reached the end of the hallway and pressed my hand against the biometric scanner for the private executive elevator. The heavy steel doors slid open. I stepped inside, ready to descend to the underground garage and lead the tactical convoy myself. But before the doors could slide shut, a hand shot out and caught the metal frame. It was my chief legal counsel, a brilliant and ruthless attorney I kept on retainer specifically for high-stakes corporate warfare. He stepped into the elevator, his face completely drained of color, holding his encrypted tablet tightly against his chest. He told me we had a critical breach. He said a red alert had just flashed across our automated legal monitoring system. He turned the tablet around so I could read the freshly filed court documents. It was an emergency temporary restraining order signed and executed less than 10 minutes ago by a highly connected judge in Fulton County. I stared at the legal filing, the words burning themselves into my retinas. The petitioners on the restraining order were not Vivian's corporate lawyers. The petitioners were my own sister Jada and her husband Greg. They had driven straight from my kitchen to the local police precinct. Working directly on Vivian's payroll, they had filed a sworn affidavit claiming I had suffered a violent psychotic break. Jada had taken the brief moment. I grabbed her wrist in my kitchen to stop her vicious, unprovoked assault. She lied to the police, stating I had pinned her against the granite counter and physically attacked her. Greg submitted a fabricated statement claiming I was wildly jealous of Zuri's new billionaire lifestyle. He wrote that I was raving like a lunatic, screaming that if I could not have Zuri, nobody could. It was a perfectly crafted narrative designed to prey on the worst stereotypes of an angry, unstable woman. They claimed I was heavily armed and actively stalking my daughter with the intent to cause massive bodily harm. Vivian had orchestrated the entire thing. She knew I would eventually discover the medical truth. She knew I would come for Zuri with everything I had. so she used the most effective disposable pawns she could find, my own flesh and blood, to build a legal fortress around the hospital. Vivian's high-priced attorneys had fast-tracked the false police report directly to a judge on her payroll, painting me as a deranged and violently dangerous threat. My chief counsel explained the devastating reality of the document. The judge had granted a maximum distance emergency injunction. I was legally barred from coming within 1,000 feet of Zuri Vivian the estate, or any private medical facility associated with Vivian's holding company. He looked me in the eye and delivered the crushing blow. He told me that Vivian had already forwarded the restraining order to the local police departments and her private security force. If I stepped foot near that estate or the hospital, I would be immediately surrounded by armed police officers and arrested on felony charges for violating a court order. I stood in the elevator, the cold metal walls feeling like a cage closing in around me. Vivian had boxed me in with breathtaking cruelty. She knew that if I was sitting in a county jail cell waiting for a bail hearing, I could not stop her private surgical team from putting my daughter under the knife. If I used brute force now, I would lose. I would be locked in a cage while Vivian harvested my child to save her legitimate heir and unlock her billions. The hospital alert was burning a hole in my mind. Vivian was not going to wait. She had the legal cover she needed. She was going to push the surgery timeline up. My daughter was lying in a sterile room right now, heavily medicated and completely isolated from the outside world, believing her real mother loved her, while a team of private surgeons prepared to carve her open. Every minute I was delayed by this legal trap was a minute closer to the scalpel. The intense white-hot panic that threatened to overwhelm me suddenly crystallized into absolute zero ice. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air of the elevator. I stepped back out into the bullpen, my posture perfectly straight. I told my security team to stand down the physical extraction. We could not storm the hospital while that legal order was active. I had to invalidate the restraining order, and I had to do it immediately. The only way to break Vivian's legal shield was to completely destroy the credibility of the people who filed it. I looked at Chloe and told her to track Greg's exact location. If my sister and her husband wanted to use the law as a weapon against me, I was going to use my empire to publicly execute them. Chloe's fingers danced across her keyboard, pulling up Greg's digital calendar and public appearances. She informed me that Greg was scheduled to speak at a highly publicized local community center event this afternoon. I was planning to stand on a stage and shake hands with local politicians trying to secure municipal contracts for his failing real estate business. I was planning to show his face in public and pretend to be an upstanding citizen while my daughter was being prepped for slaughter. I turned to my legal team and told them to pack the foreclosure documents, the default notices, and the certified digital footprint reports. We were shifting targets. I was going to walk into that community center and dismantle Greg and Jada in front of the entire city. I was going to strip them of their wealth, their dignity, and their freedom, and I was going to use their absolute destruction as the key to unlock the gates of Vivian's fortress. I left the underground garage of my corporate headquarters with a single terrifying focus. My tactical extraction team was standing by, waiting for the signal to breach Vivian's iron gates, but they could not move as long as that fraudulent restraining order was active. I had to shatter Vivian's legal shield, and the only way to do that was to publicly execute the credibility of the people who filed it. My sister Jada and her husband Greg had weaponized the law against me to buy Vivian time to harvest my daughter. They were going to pay for that decision with the last shreds of their freedom. Chloe had tracked Greg's phone to a local community center in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The center was hosting its annual Urban Development and Small Business Summit. I knew the event well. In fact, I had been scheduled as a guest speaker for months, representing a philanthropic branch of my firm that the public actually knew about. Greg knew my schedule. He knew the auditorium would be packed with city council members, local politicians, and wealthy real estate investors. I saw it as the perfect stage to publicly humiliate me and solidify his fabricated narrative. He wanted a high-profile audience to watch him put the crazy, unstable woman in handcuffs. He thought he was walking into a slaughter, but he had no idea he was the prey. I walked through the double doors of the community center and smoothly made my way backstage. The event coordinator smiled warmly and handed me a microphone. I walked out onto the brightly lit stage and stepped up to the wooden podium. I looked out over the crowded auditorium. There were hundreds of people seated in the velvet chairs, listening attentively. My voice was steady, my posture was perfect. I spoke clearly about economic empowerment and community resilience. No one in that room had any idea that my heart was screaming in my chest. No one knew that my 23-year-old daughter was trapped behind iron gates across the city being prepped for a brutal surgical harvest. I held the room's attention perfectly. Then the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium slammed open. The loud bang echoed off the high ceilings, cutting my speech short. Greg marched down the center aisle of the auditorium. He brought two uniformed city police officers with him. He was wearing his signature pastel polo and a tailored blazer, looking every bit the entitled savior. Jada was trailing right behind him, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the terrified, traumatized sister perfectly. They walked with aggressive, armed confidence, completely disrupting the summit. Greg did not wait to reach the front of the room. He pointed his finger directly at the stage and shouted for the officers to apprehend me. He projected his voice so every single local politician and investor in the room could hear him. He announced that I was a deranged, violently unstable woman. He claimed I was actively stalking my adopted daughter because I was insanely jealous of her new billionaire family. The audience gasped. Murmurs of shock and confusion rippled through the crowd. Local leaders and business owners turned in their seats, whispering to one another. Greg thrived on the attention. He loved being the center of the spectacle. He told the room that I had physically attacked his wife in a jealous rage just hours ago. He waved the freshly signed temporary restraining order in the air like it was a golden ticket. He turned to the police officers and demanded they arrest me for violating the court order and being an immediate danger to society. Jada let out a loud, dramatic sob, clinging to Greg's arm and hiding her face. She sobbed that she was terrified of me and begged the officers to get me away from her. It was a perfectly crafted performance designed to prey on the worst stereotypes of an angry, unstable black woman. They expected me to panic. They wanted me to raise my voice to defend myself, to scream that they were lying. They needed me to look crazy so the police would tackle me to the ground and drag me out in cuffs. A younger version of me might have panicked. A less experienced woman might have yelled back at the blatant lies. But I was not that woman. I knew that every second I spent arguing with a fool was a second Vivian used to push a scalpel closer to my daughter. I let the silence stretch. I let Greg's echoing shouts fade into the uncomfortable quiet of the auditorium. I looked down at the two police officers who were now standing at the base of the stage. The older officer placed a resting hand on his duty belt and asked me to step down to discuss a violation of a court order. His body language was tense, anticipating a violent reaction based on Greg's hysterical claims. I calmly closed my presentation folder. I did not reach for the microphone. I did not make any sudden movements. I stepped down from the podium and walked slowly, deliberately down the center stairs of the stage to meet them. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the officers. I kept my hands fully visible and my expression completely blank. I spoke in a voice so calm and measured it instantly diffused the physical tension the officers were holding. I told them I was fully aware of the emergency injunction they had been asked to enforce. I told them I respected their duty to protect the public, but I also told them I understood the severe federal penalties for filing a false police report and committing deliberate perjury to obtain a judge's signature. Greg scoffed loudly, stepping forward to interrupt me. He told the cops I was a liar and a manipulator who was just trying to talk my way out of an arrest. He demanded they put the handcuffs on me before I hurt someone else. I did not even look at Greg. I kept my eyes locked respectfully on the older police officer. I reached slowly into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick bound document stamped with a certified federal seal. I handed it directly to the officer. I explained that it was a certified digital footprint and cellular geolocation report pulled directly from the telecommunications grid. I asked him to turn to the 3rd page. The officer frowned, taking the heavy document and flipping it open. I explained the data loud enough for the front rows of the audience to hear clearly. I told the officer that Greg and Jada had sworn under penalty of perjury that I violently attacked them in my kitchen at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. I pointed to the highlighted section on the page. I explained that the certified cellular data, GPS tracking logs, and time-stamped toll booth camera footage proved unequivocally that Greg and Jada were sitting at a casino resort 50 miles away at the exact moment they claimed I assaulted them. The older officer's eyes widened as he read the undeniable proof. The document contained high-resolution photographs of Greg's car at the casino parking gate, time-stamped exactly when the supposed attack occurred. It contained banking logs showing Greg withdrawing funds at a casino ATM at 9:15 in the morning. The evidence was absolute and irrefutable. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had lied to the police, lied to a judge, and weaponized the legal system to harass me. The officer slowly lowered the document and turned his head to look at Greg. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The police were no longer looking at me as a threat. They were looking at Greg and Jada as criminals who had just wasted police resources and committed a serious felony. Greg's face went completely slack. The arrogant, triumphant posture he had carried down the aisle dissolved in a matter of seconds. He stammered, taking a step backward away from the police officers. He tried to claim the document was fake, that I had somehow manufactured the data to frame him. But the federal certification stamps on the report told a different story. Jada stopped her fake sobbing, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits as she realized they were entirely trapped. I stepped closer to Greg, closing the distance between us. The politicians and investors in the audience watched in stunned silence as the wealthy real estate developer unraveled before their eyes. I told Greg he had made a fatal mistake, thinking he could use the law to lock me in a cage. I told him he had sold my daughter to a monster to save his failing business, and now he was going to pay the ultimate price. I did not raise my voice, but the cold, lethal promise in my words made him physically shake. The legal shield Vivian had built was officially broken. The path to the hospital was clear. Now it was time to strip Greg of everything he owned. I stood inches away from Greg, watching the last remnants of his arrogance bleed out onto the floor of the community center. The older police officer closed the certified federal dossier I had just handed him. He looked from the high-resolution photographs of Greg's car at the casino toll booth straight into Greg's panicked eyes. The officer did not look amused. He asked Greg if he wanted to explain how his wife was supposedly being violently assaulted in my suburban kitchen at 9 o'clock in the morning, while he was simultaneously withdrawing $500 from a casino ATM 50 miles away in the exact opposite direction. Greg opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless stutter came out. He looked at Jada, hoping she would produce another batch of fake tears to save him from the rapidly collapsing lie. But Jada was frozen in place. She was staring at the police officers, finally realizing that lying on a sworn affidavit to obtain an emergency injunction was not some clever family scheme she could easily talk her way out of. It was a severe criminal offense. The younger officer stepped forward, placing his hand squarely on his utility belt. His voice echoed through the silent auditorium as he informed Greg that filing a false police report was a serious matter, but committing deliberate perjury to manipulate a judge into signing a restraining order was a felony. He stated that it carried mandatory prison time. He told Greg to keep his hands completely visible while they verified the federal documents I had provided. The atmosphere in the room had shifted into something suffocating and absolute. The local politicians, city council members, and wealthy commercial investors who had been sitting in the audience were now watching Greg with undisguised contempt. These were the exact people Greg had come here to impress today. He had intentionally orchestrated this public spectacle because he wanted to secure lucrative municipal contracts and elevate his social standing in the city. He had wanted a high-profile audience to watch him put the unstable, unpredictable sister in handcuffs. Instead, he had just broadcast his own criminal fraud to the entire room of people who controlled his industry. I watched Greg lock eyes with a prominent city developer sitting in the front row. It was a man Greg had been desperately trying to court for a joint venture for over a year. The developer slowly shook his head, his face twisted in disgust, and deliberately turned his back. The public humiliation was absolute and instant. Greg's breathing became ragged. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save himself, he turned on his own wife. He pointed a shaking finger at Jada and told the police officers that the restraining order was entirely her idea. He stammered out that Jada had exaggerated the kitchen incident and that he was just trying to support his traumatized wife. Jada gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock as her golden husband threw her directly under the bus to save his own skin. She grabbed his arm, her voice shrill and frantic as she yelled that he was the one who negotiated the payout with Vivian. The perfect wealthy couple was completely imploding, turning on each other the second their scheme fell apart. Before the police officers could intervene and separate them, the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open for a second time. My chief legal counsel walked through the entryway, flanked by two senior litigation partners from my firm. They wore immaculate dark suits and carried themselves with the predatory grace of corporate assassins. They walked straight down the center aisle, their leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor, completely ignoring the stunned whispers of the crowd. They bypassed the police officers and stopped right beside me. My chief counsel did not say a word. He simply reached into his briefcase and handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope. I took the envelope and turned my attention back to Greg. I told him that Vivian's empty promises and fake finder's fees could not save him from the reality of his own financial incompetence. I held the heavy envelope out to him. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely take it from my grasp. I did not lower my voice. I wanted every single investor and politician in that room to hear exactly what happens when someone tries to cross me and threaten my child. I told Greg to open the envelope. When his trembling fingers fumbled with the clasp, I narrated the contents for him. I announced that the envelope contained an immediate foreclosure and eviction notice for all three of his downtown commercial properties. Greg pulled the thick stack of legal papers from the envelope, his eyes darting frantically across the top page. I reminded him that my proxy firm had bought out his toxic high-interest loans 3 days ago and that he was severely in default. I explained that because his properties were commercial and heavily leveraged with fraudulent collateral, the standard residential grace periods did not apply to him. I told him that my asset liquidation team was currently standing in the lobbies of his office buildings alongside local county sheriffs. They were changing the locks, freezing his corporate bank accounts, and seizing every piece of equipment inside the buildings. Jada let out a strangled, horrific cry. She lunged forward, grabbing the eviction notices out of Greg's hands and staring at the legal seals. She screamed that I could not do this to family. She yelled that they needed those buildings to survive, to pay their mortgages, to maintain their lifestyle, and that I was leaving them with absolutely nothing. She pleaded with me, telling me I was taking everything they had worked for. I looked at my sister, the woman who had locked me out in the freezing rain 20 years ago when my daughter was sick, the woman who had just smiled while a billionaire stripped me of my child on a graduation lawn. I told Jade that she stopped being my family the second she put a price tag on my daughter. I told her that she was finally getting the exact life she deserved. I turned back to Greg. He was staring blindly at the floor, his chest heaving, his perfectly crafted reality reduced to rubble. I told him he was completely finished in this city. I pointed to the audience of investors and city officials watching him. I told Greg that no bank would ever lend to him again. No politician would ever grant him a zoning permit. No commercial contractor would ever return his calls. How was a disgraced bankrupt fraud who was about to face federal perjury charges and massive civil litigation. I stepped closer, dropping my voice, so only he and Jada could hear the final absolute truth. I told them they had walked into this auditorium hoping to ruin my life, but they had just handed me the match to burn their entire empire to the ground. I told them to enjoy their new lives because the wealthy elite facade they loved so much was officially dead and buried. The police officers stepped forward, advising Greg and Jada that they needed to step outside immediately to discuss the fabricated police report. Greg did not resist. He let the officers guide him away, his shoulders slumped, his spirit completely broken. Jada followed behind him, weeping openly, her designer trench coat looking ridiculous as she was escorted out of the building in absolute disgrace. I did not stay to watch them leave. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a sharp, urgent rhythm that cut through the satisfaction of the moment. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a red alert from my intelligence contact embedded inside Vivian's private medical network. The message was brief, but it made the blood freeze in my veins. Vivian had moved the surgery date up. She was hosting a massive welcome home gala tonight at the estate to publicly legitimize Zuri as a permanent part of the family. And immediately following the gala at the break of dawn, they were taking Zuri into the private surgical suite. Time had completely run out. I turned my back on Greg's trembling form and walked right up to the edge of the stage. I looked directly at the city council members, the local politicians, and the wealthy commercial investors sitting in the front rows. I did not need a microphone. The absolute silence in the auditorium amplified my voice perfectly. I told them exactly who they had been doing business with. I broke down Greg's entire financial portfolio piece by piece, leaving no stone unturned. I explained how he had been taking municipal grants, meant for urban community development, and illegally funneling the capital into offshore shell companies to cover his massive personal debts. I detailed how he used those same community projects as fraudulent collateral to secure high-interest loans from predatory lenders. I told the investors that Greg had essentially been running a localized Ponzi scheme right under their noses, and that my firm had just acquired every single one of his defaulted notes. I watched the faces of the city planners morph from shock into pure outrage. A prominent bank executive in the second row actually stood up and pulled out his phone, clearly intending to freeze Greg's remaining local accounts. I made sure every person in that room understood that Greg was not just bankrupt, but financially radioactive. I told them that any firm caught doing business with him moving forward would be subjected to the same aggressive forensic audits my team had just executed. I effectively blacklisted him from the entire commercial real estate industry in the state. He was a dead man walking in the corporate world. Jada could not handle the reality of her collapsing status. She broke away from the police officers and ran toward me, her designer heels stumbling on the carpet. She threw her hands out, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She begged me to stop talking. She played the ultimate manipulative card, invoking the sacred bond of family. She cried that we were sisters, that we shared the same parents, that we grew up in the same house. She pleaded with me to remember our childhood, and asked how I could possibly destroy my own flesh and blood over a simple misunderstanding. She swore she did not know the extent of Vivian's plans and begged me to show her mercy for the sake of our family name. I looked at Jada and felt absolutely nothing, no pity, no residual sisterly affection. I told her that she lost the right to use the word family the moment she accepted a bribe from a billionaire to sell out her own niece. I raised my voice just enough so the police officers and the remaining crowd could hear exactly what kind of monster my sister truly was. I told Jada I knew all about the massive cash injection she and Greg were promised for delivering Zuri to a slaughterhouse. I laid it all bare right there in the community center. I told her I knew Vivian was not planning a loving family reunion, but a forced medical harvesting operation to save a dying heir. I told Jada she had actively conspired to trade my daughter's life for a real estate bailout. Jada gasped, clapping her hands over her mouth as the crowd erupted into horrified whispers. She tried to stammer out a denial, trying to claim Vivian had tricked them too, but I cut her off immediately. I told her that financial ruin was just the beginning of her punishment. I promised her that the second I had Zuri safe, I was going to hand my firm's complete intelligence dossier straight over to the federal authorities. I told Jada my legal team was already drafting the paperwork to ensure she and Greg faced federal indictments for conspiracy to commit medical extortion, wire fraud, and aiding in the kidnapping of an adult dependent. I promised her I would buy front row seats to watch a judge sentence them to federal prison. The two police officers stepped forward, completely appalled by what they had just heard. They did not gently escort Greg and Jada toward the exit this time. They grabbed Greg by the arms, turning him around and securing his wrists behind his back. They read him his rights regarding the felony perjury charges stemming from the false restraining order. Jada collapsed to her knees on the auditorium floor, sobbing uncontrollably as an officer pulled her up by her expensive trench coat and led her away in disgrace. I watched them get dragged out through the double doors, their perfect, wealthy facade completely obliterated. My legal team stood silently behind me, surveying the damage we had just inflicted. I had won the battle. I had shattered Vivian's legal shield and cleared the path to the hospital. But the brief surge of victory died the moment a sharp buzzing sensation radiated from my coat pocket. It was not my standard corporate phone. It was the specialized encrypted burner device I kept strictly for incoming covert intelligence. My pulse spiked. I pulled the phone out and looked at the glowing screen. The message was from my highest-level operative deeply embedded inside Vivian's private medical network. The text was highlighted in bright red, indicating an absolute catastrophic emergency. I read the words, and all the air left my lungs. The operative confirmed that Vivian had panicked after receiving word that her restraining order might be compromised. She knew I was coming. She had accelerated the entire timeline. The message stated that Vivian was hosting a massive welcome home gala tonight at the estate. She had invited hundreds of elite socialites, politicians, and media outlets to publicly legitimize Zuri as a permanent beloved part of her family. It was a massive public relations smokescreen designed to make Zuri look completely happy and safe while surrounded by high society witnesses. But the second half of the message made my blood turn to ice. The operative warned that immediately following the gala at the break of dawn, Vivian's private security team was instructed to move Zuri directly into the underground surgical suite. The medical team was already on site prepping the harvesting equipment. Vivian was not waiting for the end of the week. She was going to put my daughter under the knife in a matter of hours. I stared at the screen, the reality of the ticking clock crushing down on my chest. The sun was already beginning to set outside the community center. I had less than 12 hours to infiltrate a heavily fortified mansion filled with the city's most powerful elite, bypass a private military security detail, and pull my daughter off an operating table before a billionaire carved her open. Time had completely run out. I shoved the burner phone back into my pocket and turned to my crisis management team. I told them to get the cars ready. We were going to a gala. I had just dismantled my sister and her husband in front of the city elite. But the victory meant absolutely nothing while the clock was ticking down on my daughter's life. I walked out of the community center and climbed into the back of the sleek black vehicle my extraction team had brought to the curb. My lead physical security director, a former federal marshal named Tyson, handed me a secured tablet as the driver merged onto the highway. We were heading straight into the lion's den. I needed to shed the disguise I had worn for the last 10 years. The suburban administrative assistant who wore practical shoes and bought clothes on clearance was dead. I was walking into a fortress built by a billionaire, and I needed to look like I owned the building. My team had anticipated this. Waiting for me in the back of the vehicle was a garment bag containing a custom-tailored floor-length crimson gown. I changed in the back of the moving car, pulling my hair up into a sharp, flawless style. I slipped on a pair of stiletto heels that cost more than my brother-in-law's monthly mortgage. When I looked in the tinted window glass, I did not see a grieving mother. I saw a corporate executioner ready to burn a billionaire to the ground. Vivian had chosen the Grand Solstice Hotel for her welcome home gala. It was the most exclusive, heavily fortified luxury venue in downtown Atlanta. As we pulled up to the perimeter, I could see the massive security operation Vivian had deployed. The entire block was cordoned off. Private armed guards lined the red carpet checking credentials with brutal efficiency. Local police officers had been hired for traffic control, creating a solid wall of flashing blue and red lights. Paparazzi and local media outlets were penned behind velvet ropes, desperate to get a shot of the reclusive billionaire and her newly discovered daughter. Vivian was using the press as a human shield. She wanted the entire city to witness her playing the role of the tragic loving mother, finally reunited with her stolen child. She thought the flashing cameras would prove she was a saint, making it completely impossible for anyone to suspect she was about to harvest her daughter's organs the moment the cameras turned off. Tyson turned to me from the front passenger seat. He warned me that Vivian's security detail had my face flagged at every checkpoint because of the temporary restraining order. If I tried to sneak in through the service corridors or the kitchen, they would spot me, tackle me to the ground, and have me arrested for trespassing before I ever reached the ballroom. I looked at Tyson and told him I had absolutely no intention of sneaking into anywhere. I was not going to hide in the shadows like a common thief. I was going to walk straight through the front door. I pulled a heavy gold foil envelope out of my leather portfolio. Vivian thought her billionaire status made her the most powerful person in the city. She forgot that my crisis management firm handled the toxic secrets of people who could buy and sell her holding company before breakfast. I had spent the 30-minute car ride calling in a massive favor from one of my most lucrative clients, a multinational shipping magnate who practically owned the downtown commercial grid. I was on Vivian's VIP guest list, and he had happily transferred his platinum credential directly to my name. The vehicle pulled up to the drop-off zone right at the base of the red carpet. The driver opened my door and I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. The flashes of the paparazzi cameras immediately blinded me, but I did not flinch. I kept my posture straight, my chin high. I walked up the carpet with the cold, absolute confidence of a woman who held the world by the throat. Tyson and two of my elite security contractors walked 2 steps behind me, blending in perfectly with the high society bodyguards surrounding the other guests. We reached the main entrance where a massive man with a clipboard and a radio earpiece stood blocking the golden doors. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing as he recognized my face from the security briefing. He stepped forward, putting his hand out to stop me. He told me I was not on the approved entry list and that he was authorized to detain me. I did not stop walking. I did not even break my stride. I held out the platinum VIP credential, holding it right in front of his face. I told him in a voice as cold as ice to scan the barcode and look at the name of the billionaire who personally sponsored my entry. I told him that if he put a single finger on me, he would not just lose his job, he would lose his pension, his security license, and his freedom by tomorrow morning. The guard hesitated. He scanned the barcode with his device. The screen lit up bright green, verifying my elite corporate credential and my VIP sponsorship. He looked at his screen, then looked back at me, the confidence completely draining from his eyes. He knew he could not turn away a platinum guest without causing a massive scene in front of the press, and he definitely could not risk infuriating the shipping magnate who sponsored me. He swallowed hard, took a step back, and opened the heavy golden door. I walked into the grand ballroom, and the sheer scale of Vivian's deception washed over me. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over hundreds of Atlanta's most powerful elites. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne through the crowd of politicians, celebrities, and corporate investors. Soft classical music played from a string quartet in the corner. It was a masterpiece of public relations. Everyone in the room was smiling, clinking glasses, and celebrating the beautiful, heartwarming reunion of a billionaire and her lost daughter. None of them knew they were drinking champagne in a slaughterhouse. I recognized local senators, media moguls, and hospital board directors mingling near the front. Vivian had invited the exact people necessary to validate her fabricated story. If she paraded Zuri in front of the city's most influential leaders, no one would ever question the sudden medical emergency that would inevitably follow tomorrow morning. It was a brilliant psychopathic strategy. I knew somewhere in this massive hotel, or perhaps already sedated in a private suite upstairs, my daughter was waiting. Vivian had likely pumped her full of tranquilizers disguised as wellness supplements to keep her compliant. The thought of Zuri sitting in a drug-induced haze, believing she was finally safe, while a surgical team sharpened their scalpels, made my blood boil. But I pushed the rage down deep into my core. Anger makes you sloppy, and tonight I needed to be flawless. I scanned the massive room. My eyes darted past the silk drapery and the towering floral arrangements. I was looking for the exits, the security blind spots, and the audio-visual control booth. My tactical team fanned out seamlessly, disappearing into the crowd to secure the perimeter. We were completely inside the fortress, and Vivian had absolutely no idea. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, not to drink, but to blend in. I stood near the back of the room, cloaked in the shadows of a massive ice sculpture, and waited. The trap was set. Now I just needed the monster to step onto the stage. The heavy crystal chandeliers above me began to dim, casting a dramatic hush over the sprawling ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing, fading out in perfect synchronization. A brilliant white spotlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the grand stage at the far end of the room. A collective breath seemed to leave the hundreds of elite guests surrounding me. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the ice sculpture, watching the monster step into the light. Vivian glided up to the microphone wearing a custom ivory gown that made her look like an absolute saint. She paused, gripping the sides of the acrylic podium, bowing her head just long enough to let the cameras capture her manufactured vulnerability. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glistening with perfectly timed tears. She began to speak, and her voice echoed through the massive ballroom, smooth, melodic, and dripping with toxic deception. She thanked the senators, the hospital board directors, and the wealthy investors for gathering to witness the greatest miracle of her life. She placed a hand over her heart and told the silent, captivated audience that for 20 agonizing years she had been walking through a nightmare. She spun a fabricated story so deeply vile it made my stomach turn. She claimed that 2 decades ago her precious baby girl had been stolen from her. She described spending millions of dollars hiring private investigators and flying across the globe chasing false leads and empty promises. She painted herself as the ultimate tragic heroine, a mother who never gave up hope, who kept a candle burning in the window for a child snatched away by a cruel world. The audience bought every single word. Wealthy socialites dabbed at their eyes with silk handkerchiefs. Camera shutters clicked frantically, capturing the stunning emotional performance of a billionaire brought to her knees by a mother's love. But I knew the truth. I knew she had dumped that child in a freezing alleyway without a second thought to hide her infidelity. I knew the only reason she was shedding tears right now was because her legitimate son was dying, and she desperately needed a donor to unlock the trust fund that would save her bankrupt empire. Vivian raised her hand, signaling toward the heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage. She announced with a trembling voice that the nightmare was finally over. She asked the audience to welcome her beautiful stolen daughter back to where she truly belonged. The curtains parted. 2 women dressed in sleek black evening gowns guided Zuri out onto the stage. They looked like personal assistants, but my trained eyes instantly recognized their rigid posture and firm grips. They were private medical nurses functioning as handlers. They positioned Zuri next to Vivian under the glaring spotlight, and the sight of my daughter nearly brought me to my knees. Zuri was wearing a stunning designer dress draped in diamonds that sparkled under the lights. But the girl inside the clothes was completely hollowed out. Her movements were sluggish, uncoordinated, and heavy. Her usually bright, vibrant eyes were glassy and vacant, staring blankly out into the crowd without focusing on a single face. They had covered her skin in thick, expensive makeup, but they could not hide the pale, sickly undertone of her complexion. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Zuri was not just overwhelmed by the cameras, she was heavily sedated. Vivian had pumped my daughter full of powerful tranquilizers to keep her compliant and docile. She was chemically restraining a 23-year-old girl, forcing her to stand on a stage and play the role of the happy reunited daughter, while her body was actively being prepped for an invasive, unconsented organ harvest. Zuri swayed slightly, her knees buckling for a fraction of a second. The nurse standing behind her immediately gripped her waist, propping her back up, mimicking a supportive embrace. Vivian wrapped an arm around Zuri's shoulders, pulling her close and kissing her cheek for the cameras. A violent, protective fury ignited in my chest, burning away any remaining shred of patience I possessed. This was not a gala. This was a hostage situation operating in plain sight. I did not wait for Vivian to finish her twisted toast. I stepped out from the shadows of the ice sculpture. I let my empty champagne glass drop onto a passing waiter's silver tray with a sharp clink. I adjusted the fabric of my crimson gown, squared my shoulders, and walked directly into the center aisle of the grand ballroom. I did not sneak. I did not rush. I marched forward with the absolute predatory authority of a woman executing a corporate strike. The sharp staccato click of my stiletto heels against the polished marble floor began to cut through the quiet murmurs of the audience. The wealthy elites standing in my path instinctively parted, moving aside as they felt the sheer force of the energy radiating off me. Vivian's elite private security detail spotted me immediately. The men in dark suits stationed along the perimeter recognized my face from the illegal restraining order they had been instructed to enforce. I saw the lead guard tap his earpiece, his eyes widening in alarm as he realized the primary threat had just walked right through their impenetrable front door. He signaled to 3 other massive guards who immediately broke from the wall, moving swiftly to intercept me before I could reach the front row. They expected me to flinch. They expected me to stop walking or try to run. I did neither. I kept my eyes locked dead on Vivian, keeping my pace perfectly measured. Before Vivian's guards could even come within 10 feet of me, my own tactical team initiated the countermeasure. Tyson and my elite private contractors emerged seamlessly from the crowd surrounding me. They did not pull weapons or cause a massive brawl that would trigger a panic. They executed a flawless silent block. Tyson stepped directly into the path of Vivian's lead guard, driving a hard shoulder into his chest and pinning him subtly but forcefully against a decorative stone pillar. 2 more of my men intercepted the flanking guards, gripping their arms with bone-crushing pressure and masking the takedowns as aggressive embraces between old friends. The path to the stage remained completely clear. I reached the very front row, standing just inches away from the base of the grand platform. Vivian was raising her glass to the crowd, preparing to deliver the final toast that would seal my daughter's fate. She glanced down toward the center aisle, expecting to see her security team maintaining order. Instead, she saw me. I was standing directly beneath her, bathed in the spillover of the stage lights, my crimson dress looking like a fresh wound against the pristine white decor. Vivian stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her arm froze in the air, holding the crystal glass. The mask of the grieving, loving mother cracked and completely shattered. Real, genuine panic flooded her eyes. She looked at the center aisle, seeing her security guards neutralized by men she did not recognize. She looked back down at me, her chest heaving as she realized the administrative assistant from the suburbs had just effortlessly breached a billionaire fortress. Vivian dropped her glass. It shattered against the stage floor, spilling champagne across the wood. She frantically motioned to the sound engineer in the corner booth, screaming into the microphone for someone to call the police and arrest me. I did not give her the chance to finish the command. I raised my hand and tapped the sleek encrypted earpiece hidden beneath my hair. I spoke one single word to Chloe, my head of cyber intelligence, who was sitting in my war room across the city. Execute. The retaliation was instantaneous and absolute. A deafening, high-pitched screech of digital feedback ripped through the ballroom's sound system, forcing the hundreds of guests to clap their hands over their ears. The microphone Vivian was holding went completely dead, rendering her frantic screams totally silent. The warm, elegant ambient lighting in the ballroom instantly cut out, plunging the crowd into darkness for a fraction of a second before the emergency override kicked in. Blinding, harsh white utility lights flooded the room, stripping away the romantic billionaire illusion and exposing the stark reality of the space. Behind Vivian, the massive velvet curtains retracted, automatically driven by a digital command. No one in the building could stop. The 3 towering projection screens that formed the backdrop of the stage flickered violently. Vivian turned around, her face completely drained of color, staring at the massive black screens behind her. She had no control. She had no security. She had no voice. The audio-visual system of the most exclusive hotel in Atlanta had just been completely hijacked by my firm, and the stage was officially mine. I reached into the bodice of my crimson gown and pulled out a sleek wireless microphone. My cyber intelligence team had already synced to the hotel audio system. My voice boomed through the massive ballroom speakers, crystal clear and absolute, overriding the panicked shouts of the security guards. I told the hundreds of politicians, investors, and socialites to keep their eyes glued to the towering projection screens that had just descended behind the stage. The massive black screens flared to life, bathing the room in a stark white glow. The first document displayed was a scanned, yellowing piece of paper bearing the official seal of the Atlanta Police Department from exactly 20 years ago. I walked slowly up the short set of stairs and stepped onto the stage right beside Vivian. I looked out at the sea of wealthy elites and told them they were not witnessing a miraculous, heartwarming family reunion tonight. I read the highlighted sections of the police report out loud, so there could be absolutely no misunderstandings. The report detailed a 3-year-old girl found abandoned in a commercial dumpster alleyway, suffering from severe exposure and a life-threatening asthma attack. I turned my head to look directly at Vivian, whose perfect aristocratic face had contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. I told the silent captive room that Vivian did not spend 20 years agonizingly searching for a stolen child. I told them she spent 20 years hiding the physical evidence of an illicit affair that would have instantly voided her ironclad prenuptial agreement with her late billionaire husband. She threw her own toddler into the freezing rain to protect her luxury lifestyle. The wealthy elites in the audience gasped. A crystal champagne flute slipped from a socialite hand and shattered loudly against the marble floor. Vivian lunged toward me, her manicured hands curled into claws, screaming that the documents were forged and that I was an insane stalker trying to ruin her family. I did not flinch. I did not even take a step back. I tapped the encrypted earpiece hidden under my hair and gave Chloe the signal for the second phase of the execution. The screens behind us shifted instantly. The police report vanished, replaced by highly classified hospital compatibility charts and the strict legal stipulations of Vivian late husband trust fund. I turned my back to Vivian, dismissing her completely, and addressed the terrified audience directly. I told them Vivian was acting out of pure desperation because her legitimate son, the sole heir to her multi-billion-dollar fortune, was currently lying in a hospital bed dying of terminal organ failure. I explained the fatal legal clause displayed on the screen behind me. If that boy died before his 25th birthday, the entire corporate empire reverted to his father's extended family, leaving Vivian with absolutely nothing but mounting debt. I turned to look at Zuri. My daughter was standing frozen, her heavily medicated mind fighting violently to process the massive medical documents displayed above her head. I walked closer to her, my voice softening just a fraction, but still echoing through the ballroom speakers. I told my daughter the devastating truth. I told her Vivian did not buy her a $3 million estate out of sudden maternal love. I pointed to the glowing medical charts, showing the exact rare genetic markers matching Zuri blood type perfectly to a dying brother she had never met. I told Zuri she was standing on that stage covered in borrowed diamonds because she was the only living donor on the planet who could save Vivian bank accounts. I exposed the luxurious wellness retreat scheduled for dawn as an invasive forced organ harvest. I told Zuri she was not brought here to be a daughter. She was brought here to be spare parts. The two private medical nurses who had been physically propping Zuri up suddenly realized their entire careers and their freedom were about to go up in flames. Understanding that they were standing in the middle of a federal medical extortion plot, they dropped Zuri's arms and backed away toward the edge of the stage, terrified of being implicated. Zuri swayed on her feet, her eyes locked on the undeniable medical data. The horrific reality of her biological mother betrayal was finally breaking through the heavy sedatives Vivian had forced into her system. Vivian was hyperventilating now, pacing the stage like a trapped feral animal. She screamed at the wealthy hospital board directors, sitting in the front row, demanding they ignore my lies and promising them massive financial donations if they called the police to have me arrested. She tried to wield her billionaire status like a weapon to force the room back into submission. She did not know I had already emptied her entire armory. I gave Chloe the final command. The medical files vanished from the three towering screens. In their place, a cascading waterfall of bright red ink filled the displays. It was Vivian's complete corporate portfolio, stripped of its shell companies and offshore camouflage. I spoke into the microphone, my voice ringing with lethal finality. I told the room of elite investors that Vivian could not donate a single dime to anyone because she was completely and functionally bankrupt. I broke down her toxic debt portfolios, her highly leveraged foreign accounts, and the fraudulent collateral she had used to prop up her failing holding company. I watched the prominent business moguls and international shipping executives in the audience turn pale as they looked at the undeniable mathematical proof of Vivian financial collapse. The people in this room had millions of dollars tied up in Vivian Ventures, and they were realizing in real time that their investments were evaporating into thin air. I announced to the entire room that my crisis management firm had spent the last 24 hours quietly buying up every single one of Vivian defaulted international loans through a proxy network. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into outright panic as executives scrambled to pull out their cell phones. I declared that a hostile corporate takeover was officially underway. I told Vivian her multi-billion-dollar empire no longer belonged to her. She was a fraud who was bleeding cash and drowning in debt. I owned her holding company. I owned her commercial real estate, and by tomorrow morning, I would legally seize every single asset attached to her name. The massive ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The pristine, elegant facade of the Welcome Home Gala shattered into a million jagged pieces the moment the red ink of Vivian's financial ruin flooded the towering projection screens. The wealthy elites in the audience, the politicians, the hospital board directors, and the international shipping magnates did not care about family drama or long-lost daughters. They only cared about their own bottom lines. And right now, they were staring at undeniable mathematical proof that their investments in Vivian's holding company were actively evaporating into dust. A deafening wave of panicked voices rose from the crowd. I watched as hundreds of the most powerful people in Atlanta simultaneously pulled their cell phones from their designer jackets and crystal clutch purses. They were frantically dialing their brokers and financial managers, shouting urgent commands over the noise of the ballroom to dump every single share of Vivian's stock before the market opened. They were scrambling to sever all ties with her corporate entities, terrified that the federal fraud investigations my firm had just promised would drag them down too. The room became a frantic stampede of self-preservation. Vivian stood on the stage completely unraveled. The perfectly poised billionaire, the tragic weeping mother she had pretended to be just 5 minutes ago, was gone. In her place was a feral, desperate woman cornered by her own colossal arrogance. Her face was flushed dark with a terrifying, murderous rage. She lunged toward the edge of the stage, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. She screamed at the top of her lungs, ordering her elite private security detail to arrest me. She shrieked at them to tackle me to the ground, to drag me out of the hotel, and to silence me by any means necessary. She demanded they shut down the projection screens and clear the ballroom, waving her arms in pure, unadulterated hysteria. I stood my ground at the base of the stage. My hands were relaxed at my sides. I did not even blink as Vivian screamed for my destruction. I shifted my gaze away from her frantic form and looked directly at the head of her private security force. I was a massive tactical contractor standing just a few feet away from me. His men had already been effectively neutralized by my own elite security team, but they were still waiting for his final command. I watched his eyes dart from Vivian's screaming face up to the glaring red financial spreadsheets projected on the massive screens. He was a mercenary. He was a man who performed high-risk services in exchange for exorbitant amounts of money. He looked at the undeniable proof that his employer was completely bankrupt. He knew that the checks Vivian had written to cover this massive security operation would inevitably bounce tomorrow morning. He knew she had absolutely no capital left to protect him from the massive federal and civil lawsuits my legal team would rain down upon anyone who dared to lay a hand on me. The head of security slowly raised his hand and pressed 2 fingers against his communication earpiece. He did not say a word to Vivian. He simply looked at his men stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom and gave a subtle, sharp shake of his head. He took a deliberate step backward, retreating into the shadows of the velvet curtains, and lowered his hands to his sides. His entire tactical team followed suit, instantly dropping their defensive postures and stepping away from the stage. They were officially standing down. Vivian saw the movement out of the corner of her eye. She whipped her head around, staring at the men she had paid to protect her. She screamed at the captain, demanding he follow her orders, reminding him of the contract they had signed. But the man simply turned his back on her. In that single defining moment, Vivian lost the absolute last shred of her power. She had no money, she had no reputation, she had no muscle to hide behind. She was completely and utterly exposed, standing naked before the ruins of her own empire. But as satisfying as it was to watch Vivian's complete destruction, my focus was no longer on the bankrupt billionaire. My eyes moved to the center of the stage, locking onto the only person in the room who actually mattered. Zuri was trembling. The heavy cocktail of sedatives and tranquilizers Vivian had pumped into her system to keep her compliant was actively burning off. The massive spike of pure adrenaline rushing through her veins was overriding the medication, snapping her mind back into sharp, terrifying focus. I watched the horrible, devastating realization wash over my daughter's face in real time. Zuri stared up at the massive projection screens, reading the glowing medical charts displaying her exact rare blood type side by side with the dying legitimate heir. She looked at the ironclad stipulations of the trust fund that required the heir to live past his 25th birthday to unlock the billions. She looked at the forged medical consent forms my team had projected right next to the schedule for her supposed wellness retreat at dawn. I watched her mind connect every single horrific dot. She realized why her phone had been completely confiscated the moment she stepped onto the estate. She realized why the heavy iron gates had been locked behind her, locking her inside a fortress, completely cut off from the outside world. She realized why there was a private medical team waiting in the guest wing monitoring her diet and taking sudden unnecessary blood samples. She realized that the velvet box containing the keys to a $3 million mansion was not a gift from a loving mother. It was a down payment on her organs. Zuri slowly turned her head and looked at Jada, who was currently being detained by local authorities near the back exits of the ballroom. She realized that her own aunt, the woman who had helped orchestrate this entire reunion, had known the truth all along. Jada had smiled and sipped champagne while selling her own niece to a butcher just to get a real estate bailout for her arrogant husband. Then Zuri looked at Vivian. She looked at the woman she shared DNA with, the woman who had abandoned her in a freezing alleyway 20 years ago, only to return and lure her into a surgical trap. Zuri realized she was never a daughter to this woman. She was just walking inventory. She was spare parts, a biological insurance policy, meant to be carved open and discarded the moment Vivian secured her fortune. The sheer crushing weight of the betrayal was too massive for the human mind to bear. The glamorous billionaire fantasy shattered, leaving nothing but the cold, clinical reality of a slaughterhouse. Zuri let out a jagged, breathless gasp. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin looking like ash beneath the heavy layers of stage makeup. Her knees gave out. She could not support the weight of her own body anymore. Zuri collapsed, dropping hard onto the polished wood of the stage, right under the glaring white spotlight. The heavy diamond necklace Vivian had draped around her throat clattered loudly against the floorboards, a hollow, meaningless sound that echoed through the silence of the stage. She wrapped her arms tightly around her own torso, curling inward as if trying to physically protect her organs from the woman standing just a few feet away. She was gasping for air, suffocating under the realization of how close she had come to dying on an operating table in the name of a family reunion. I did not wait for Vivian to move. I did not wait for the remaining crowd to react. I walked up the short set of stairs and stepped onto the stage. I completely ignored the bankrupt screaming woman to my left. I knelt down on the hard wooden floor, ruining the hem of my custom crimson gown, entirely unbothered by the dirt and the debris. I reached out and gently placed my hand on Zuri's trembling shoulder. I was not there as a corporate executioner anymore. I was there as the woman who had bought her asthma medication, who had bandaged her scraped knees, who had spent 20 years keeping her safe from a world that wanted to consume her. I was her mother, and the war was finally over. As I knelt there holding my trembling daughter, the heavy mahogany doors of the Grand Solstice Ballroom flew open for the final time tonight. A swarm of federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers flooded the venue. My legal team had transmitted the complete unredacted dossier to the federal authorities exactly 30 minutes before I stepped onto the stage. The agents marched straight past the panicked investors and surrounded Vivian. She did not look like an untouchable billionaire anymore. She looked like a cornered, terrified animal. She screamed obscenities as the lead agent read her rights for medical coercion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. They placed her in cold steel handcuffs right there on the stage she had built for her own twisted performance. I gently guided Zuri down the steps, shielding her eyes from the flashing cameras of the press. The local media was now frantically documenting the spectacular fall of a corporate empire. We walked past the back exits where local authorities were finishing processing Jada and Greg for their fabricated police reports. They were standing in the shadows of the ballroom, completely destitute. My asset liquidation team had finalized the commercial seizures while the gala was actively imploding. Jada was clutching her expensive trench coat, shivering, as she realized she had no house to return to. Greg stared at me with hollow, defeated eyes, his entire life reduced to absolute zero. They had tried to sell my daughter to save their counterfeit lifestyle, and now they were left standing in the ashes of their own greed. I walked right past them without a single glance. 7 days passed since the ballroom raid. The national media storm was relentless, but my crisis management firm kept my name and my face entirely out of the headlines. Vivian was sitting in a federal holding facility. A judge had denied her bail because her foreign accounts made her a massive flight risk. Her entire holding company was being dismantled and auctioned off to pay her international creditors. The dying legitimate heir was transferred to a state medical facility, forced to wait on a standard legal transplant list, just like everyone else. The billionaire safety net was completely gone. I was sitting at the sprawling glass desk in my corner office, reviewing a new corporate acquisition, when my private intercom buzzed. My head of physical security informed me that I had an unannounced visitor waiting in the ground floor lobby. He did not need to say her name. I knew exactly who it was. I told him to send her up to the executive floor. The heavy oak doors to my office slowly opened. Zuri walked in. She was not wearing borrowed diamonds or custom silk gowns anymore. She was wearing a simple faded sweatshirt and jeans, looking so incredibly young and fragile. The glamorous billionaire illusion had been brutally stripped away. It left behind a terrified 23-year-old girl who had almost lost her life to the monster she thought was her savior. Zuri stood in the center of my vast office, looking at the polished obsidian walls and the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. She looked at the expensive tailored suit I was wearing. She finally realized the massive magnitude of the empire I had built in the shadows just to secure our future. She took a trembling step forward, and her composure broke down completely. The tears fell hard and fast as she sank into the leather chair across from my desk. She begged for my forgiveness, her voice cracking with heavy sobs. She apologized repeatedly for the terrible things she had said on the college lawn, for being so easily blinded by the flashing cameras and the promise of elite wealth. She cried that she was foolish and naive for turning her back on the only person who had ever actually fought for her. Zuri reached across the cool glass of my desk, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She looked up at me with desperate red eyes and asked if she could please just come back home to her real mother. I looked at the young woman sitting across from me. I saw the terrified little girl I had given my entire youth to protect. I remembered the grueling double shifts, the sleepless nights, and the endless sacrifices I made to ensure she never felt the cold sting of the streets again. I loved her with every single fiber of my being. But the corporate executive inside me, the woman who built an impenetrable empire from absolute nothing, knew that rescuing her from the consequences of her choices would only destroy her in the long run. I opened the top drawer of my glass desk and pulled out a plain manila folder. I placed my hand flat on top of it and looked directly into Zuri's red, swollen eyes. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with absolute finality. I told her I loved her and I always would. But I also told her that she broke a fundamental trust when she chose the glittering illusion of wealth over the mother who actually raised her. I slid the folder across the smooth glass surface until it rested right in front of her trembling hands. I told her to open it. Zuri hesitated, taking a shaky breath before flipping the cover back. Inside the folder was a signed 12-month lease for a modest, safe apartment located in a quiet part of the city. Next to the lease was a prepaid contract for an intensive weekly therapy program. It was not a $3 million stone estate in Buckhead. It was a foundation. It was a real, authentic chance to start over. Zuri looked up at me, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She asked if she was coming back to my house. I kept my posture perfectly straight and gave her the hardest answer a mother could ever give. I said no. I told her she could not move back into my home. Zuri gasped, clutching the folder tightly to her chest, as if it were a life raft. I explained that genuine love requires firm, unyielding boundaries. I told her that the choices she made on that graduation lawn carried heavy, irreversible consequences. She had looked me in the eye and declared she did not need me anymore because she believed elite blood and billionaire status mattered more than loyalty and sacrifice. I told her I was still her mother, and I would always make sure she was safe from the monsters of the world, but she had to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet. I told her she needed to process the severe trauma Vivian had inflicted upon her. She needed to speak with the professionals I had hired to help her deprogram the toxic billionaire fantasy my sister Jada had helped feed her. Most importantly, she needed to discover who she actually was without my constant protection and without Vivian dirty money blinding her. She needed to do exactly what I did 20 years ago when I had absolutely nothing. She needed to build her own life from the ground up. Zuri sat in silence, letting my words wash over her. The entitlement and the arrogance she had absorbed from Vivian and Jada were completely gone. The harsh reality of the world had burned those illusions away. She nodded slowly, wiping her wet face with the back of her hand. She did not argue. She did not throw a tantrum or demand more than what I was offering. She simply closed the folder and stood up from the heavy leather chair. She looked at me and whispered a soft, genuine thank you. It was the first real authentic thing she had said to me in weeks. I watched my daughter walk out of my office. The heavy oak doors closed quietly behind her, leaving me alone in the vast silence of my command center. My heart ached, but my mind was completely at peace. I knew I had just given her this most valuable gift a parent could ever offer. I gave her the absolute truth. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office. The afternoon sun was setting, casting a brilliant golden light over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I looked out at the city I had conquered. My sister and her husband were ruined, stripped of their commercial properties, and facing federal indictments for their greed. Vivian was sitting in a federal holding cell, her fraudulent corporate empire reduced to ashes. I had faced the ultimate betrayal from my own blood and from the child I raised, and I did not break. I protected my peace. I built a fortress out of intellect and sheer willpower. I stood there bathed in the sunlight, completely independent, fiercely respected, and entirely untouchable. The greatest lesson we can learn from this journey is that our true worth is never defined by the people who fail to value us. Sometimes the most painful betrayals come from those who are supposed to protect and love us unconditionally, like a parent who chooses their own comfort over our well-being. It is absolutely devastating to realize that blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty or respect. However, this heartbreak can become the ultimate catalyst for profound personal growth. When we stop seeking validation from toxic environments, we finally free ourselves to build a life based on authentic happiness and self-worth. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary step for our own survival and peace of mind. We learn that family is not just about genetics, but about the people who consistently show up for us, who celebrate our victories, and who stand by us during our darkest moments. True strength comes from walking away from abuse and building your own beautiful empire from the ashes of their betrayal. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering journeys.